Are you experiencing loneliness? Yes, we all are, especially when we are less able to interact with people because of the virus. But even before coronavirus hit our shores, our nation's people have been disconnected with each other. We drive to work. We drive back home from work. We watch some TV. When we have some free time, we are scrolling through something on our smartphones. No wonder we're so lonely. We've been set up to not be connected to our neighbors. Today's guest is author and pastor Eric Jacobsen. Eric is senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Tacoma, Washington, and received his Ph.D. from Fuller Theological Seminary. He is the author of books and articles exploring what can be called a theology of place, especially the city, emphasizing the goodness of the nourishing characteristics of traditional city life, including shared spaces and thriving neighborhoods. His first book on this subject was titled Sidewalks in the Kingdom, New Urbanism and the Christian Faith, published in 2003 by Brazos Press. He wrote a more in-depth theology on this in 2012 with his book published by Baker Academic titled The Space Between, a Christian Engagement with the Built Environment. He is dedicated to the idea that people should be connected in a good way by the built environment, but that we humans have not taken the care to create such spaces for human flourishing. His latest book, published last year by Brazos, is titled 3 Pieces of Glass: Why We Feel Lonely in a World Mediated by Screens. As the subtitle suggests, we are experiencing loneliness because we spend so much time not walking among people so that we can have authentic relationships. Rather, our world is mediated through our windshields, our televisions, and our smartphones. You've been doing this theology of place for a long time.
Yeah, I have.
So tell us your journey as a pastor and theologian, how you found yourself writing about how people find belonging in community.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably been on my brain most of my life, but probably first came to my conscious attention when I was a pastor in Missoula, Montana. That was my first call. And living in what I now know as a pre-World War II neighborhood, ways they used to build neighborhoods before we started building things around the automobile. Mm-hmm. So before kind of the suburbs got rolling, we had neighborhoods where you could walk to a coffee shop or you could walk around a block. You had apartment buildings on the same block as detached houses. And I lived less than a mile from the church where I worked. And so I walked a lot to church, rode my bike, and I got to know people organically in the neighborhood. And that seemed like a really normal way. That's the kind of neighborhood I grew up in also, but I didn't think much about it. Mm-hmm. And then a couple things happened in my town in Missoula that brought to my attention that was kind of an unusual arrangement, that most of the rest of the country was living in, and all the new stuff that was being built at that time was more automobile oriented. And so just a different way of doing ministry. You kind of had to create programs, invite people to come because they would have to show, you wouldn't just run into people organically in your neighborhood when you're driving everywhere. So, that was kind of my pastoral identity. That's how I did ministry. I ran into people when I was walking from one thing to another and enjoyed that and realized that there was a lot of advantages to that. It's not the only way to do ministry, but it's certainly a lot of advantages to that. And there was a pretty active discussion at that time. This was the early 90s, pretty active discussion in the secular world about returning to that style of community and some of the more human scaled community. And I, as a Christian, thought, man, this sounds like the kind of thing Christians should be talking about. And I looked up, it's changed a little bit, but it goes by the name New Urbanism, that conversation. And so I got, I started looking at Christian sources on urban, city, those kinds of things. And all the stuff I found was it wasn't as positive about that kind of environment. It was more like, oh, the city is a really dangerous place, or cities where, lots of problems exist, homelessness and drug addicts. And, we have to fix the city or something like that. There wasn't a real awareness of the city as a kind of redemptive place or an environment where good things could happen. And so I started really trying to work as like a bridge builder, trying to connect that secular conversation to what I thought were more foundational theological roots. I think there's a lot of good urban theology in the Bible. So yeah, that's how I kind of got started.
The key to what you're talking about is, most people, when they think of the best place, the most wonderful place, what they want to do is they want to go back to Eden.
Yeah.
And you're saying, well, it started sure in the garden and Eden and all that, but it ends in a city. That's where the trajectory always has meant to go to the New Jerusalem, the city. Yeah. Could you help us navigate the idea of progressive salvation history is truly what the Bible is talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably could run at it from a couple different angles, but I guess I'll start with this notion that I don't think the Bible portrays Eden as our final destination. It's sort of the potentialities of creation that we're meant, we're given these creation mandates to steward the earth and to fill the earth, which I kind of interpret in a cultural frame. We're supposed to make things that are beautiful and bless others and whatnot. So we're given these great raw materials. We're told to join in with God and develop these things for the good of the world and to others. And so that implies the kind of development of society and development of the arts and other kinds of things that will be, part of how we're enjoying the world and giving glory to God. And so I think there's an intentionality that's supposed to go somewhere. It's not supposed to just be, a man and a woman in a garden just chilling out. I think we're supposed to have families, and then those families will connect together, and we have societies, and we build towns, and we build meaningful buildings, and all those, and we create art and stuff like that. And so I do think there's this kind of this progression of towards some kind of development of creation. Of course, then sin enters into the equation, and things go a little awry. And so, yeah, they go a lot awry. And so we have, at the same time as this, we're intended, I think, to continue to develop creation in a good way, but we also now have this alternative of developing creation in a sinful, toxic kind of way that brings harm rather than good. And so we have this struggle within us of doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. And the right thing, when we're doing the right thing, that is, shalom. That's the peace. That's the right relationships with God, with others, and with creation. We can develop creation in a kind of shalom mode or in a rebellion mode. And so we kind of we enter this world where lots of really good things have been developed that are life-giving and beautiful and delightful, and lots of really horrible things have been developed. And we enter in and are meant to pull things towards the good and bring healing where the bad happens. So there have been folks who have taken that to think, and our job then is to build the New Jerusalem. And I don't take that line. I think that's been kind of the overstep in the Christian community to think, we're going to build this beautiful, perfect place, and all suffering will be ended. We cannot do that. We're too imperfect and whatnot. So we do our job in developing culture and trying to create good and just and beautiful societies and lovely things. But at the same time, we wait for Christ's return where he'll establish the New Jerusalem. But we want to be kind of moving in the direction he wants us to be moving as we go, and sharing the gospel and doing all those things so more people can be included in that.
Trying to get more proximate to that.
Exactly.
That future. Yeah. A foretaste of the kingdom of God that will come to its fullness when Christ returns. Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the framework. And I think, so that makes the urban, the New Jerusalem is an urban environment, but it's not like anti-nature. I think there's the trees with the leaves for the healing of the nations. There's my sense is there's both urban and rural and wilderness in the new creation that will all be part of the mix. But I think there's been a little bit of a history of just wanting to go back to Eden.
Give me a vacation in the mountains of Colorado or in the Cascade Mountains near Seattle. I mean, just give me a time to be out in the pristine, unmolested world out there, right? And so people see that, or they go to the ocean. Right. There's no human messing up this thing. So it makes sense that people think that the goal
get away from all
is.
that. So that's typical. In fact, Ohio's got an interesting part of the story. So the suburbs actually were in a way kind of birthed in Ohio from a legal standpoint. I don't know if you know this. The first, not the first suburb, I should say, but Euclid, Ohio, which apparently is a suburb of Cincinnati.
That's where I was born.
Suburb of Cleveland.
Cleveland. I'm sorry. Did I say Cincinnati? Yeah, Cleveland. Yeah. I'm sorry, Cleveland. Yeah.
South Euclid.
You were born in Euclid?
I was born in Cleveland. I grew up in South Euclid. Yeah.
Okay, so interesting. So Euclid was when it developed, it was a perfect example of what we're talking about. Cleveland, I'm sure, wasn't very pretty at the time that Euclid was developed, and Euclid was developed as a kind of escape and antidote to Cleveland, right? That's the idea of the suburbs. We'll have this place. It's outside of the city. It's going to be different. It's going to be clean. It's going to be nice. It's not going to have all the junk and whatnot. And in order to do that, they had to employ something called zoning, which meant we're going to separate commercial from residential. We're going to make sure that your house is not going to have a cement factory on the same block. We're going to keep those things separate. And that led to a real estate company, Euclid Realty, thought that was against their constitutional right to develop and sell land. It was going to reduce the value of their land that they had wanted to develop for commercial purposes. Is that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Can a city dictate intense division between how you can use land? And the Supreme Court decided in favor of Euclid over Ambler Realty, and that created the way for zoning modern zoning as we know it to get rolling. That every city after that, then every suburb was built on this premise that we have to separate uses. We have to separate residential from commercial. And then that got more refined. We can't just separate residential from commercial. We have to separate like houses from apartments, and we have to separate big houses from medium-sized houses. And you get the picture. The suburbs is really about separating everything geographically into particular zones. And then you have to have a car to get from one place to the other. And that all started, kind of with Euclid. And it's really interesting. Actually, that Supreme Court case is quite interesting to read because the rationale for why they did that was pretty interesting. And it's actually, from a Christian standpoint, a little bit disturbing because prior to that case, we had noxious use laws. So you could say, oh, you can't have a cement factory in a residential neighborhood. That's a noxious use, right? You could just prohibit it case by case in that way. But what zoning did was painted a really broad brush. You can't have any commercial next to any residential, right? So that includes, you can't have a coffee shop in your neighborhood, residential neighborhood, right? So what's dangerous about that? Why, what public good is being advanced by not having a coffee shop? It's not dangerous to children. It's not loud. It's just a coffee shop, right? What's the problem? Well, in the Supreme Court case, they tell you what it is. And that is a coffee shop allows an excuse for a stranger to be in your neighborhood. Because without the coffee shop, if you don't live in the neighborhood, someone can say, why are you here? You don't own one of these houses. You're a stranger here. And they're going to be kind of have to move along. But in a coffee shop, a stranger can sit there and have a cup of coffee and be in your neighborhood and have permission to be there because they're a paying customer. And so the language of the Supreme Court case says a stranger, a criminal under the guise of being a stranger can be in your neighborhood. So it was really about banishing strangers. It was really about, why can't you have an apartment building next to a house in a neighborhood? That particular court case said, well, because, the apartment buildings block the sunlight from the houses and the children need sunlight to be healthy. And so, one critic said, there are children in the apartment buildings as well. They need sunlight. It was really about, at the end of the day, it was like, we don't want strangers in our neighborhood and we need to keep people separated by income in our where we live. And that created an American tradition that we still live with, that you have to live in a different place from people who are a different socioeconomic class than you are.
Just to be clear, this happened way before Brendan Romai was even born, right?
Yes.
Or is it really his fault?
1930,
okay.
1930, sure. 1932 or something like that.
Okay, just for the record.
You were born in 1937, weren't you, Brendan?
Yeah. just for a little bit after that, because just for the record, the river in Cleveland that caught on fire, that was before me too.
Okay.
That one also went. Yeah, I don't know if you know this. Cleveland is also why we have the EPA.
Oh, really?
The Cuyahoga River kept catching on fire, and they were like, should probably do something about that. Yeah.
Who knew Cleveland had such a huge impact?
I love Ohio.
Yeah.
It's my favorite dump on planet Earth.
Yeah. That's awesome.
That's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned that though, because I work for a commercial construction company.
Yeah.
So, I'm involved with projects all over the country, really. I mean, we're focused on Ohio, but, we do stuff out of state too. And I've noticed even in Cleveland, and I'm sure this is probably something that you're kind of about to start talking about, but I've noticed that they've kind of started to attempt to rejuvenate and reintegrate these older neighborhoods.
Yeah.
There's a neighborhood in Cleveland called Ohio City, and it's an older neighborhood, but there's all of this new construction happening right now because they're trying to draw in young people back into city living. Yeah. So like right now I'm actually working on a project that's like an integrated apartment complex. So there's apartments up top and there's shops and stuff below. And there's even like a pedestrian walkthrough. So you can cut through the building to get around everywhere.
Yeah. That's the interesting part of the story is when I was first looking into this stuff, it was sort of considered sort of unusual, to think about alternatives to the suburbs and maybe the return to walkable neighborhoods and cities. And it seemed like this kind of weird niche thing that some people were interested in. But I think it's really caught momentum. And I think a lot of young people, and by young now I'm talking about even millennials and whatnot, not even all that young anymore, are really, their housing choices have moved in a lot of ways towards walkable neighborhoods. Not everyone. I mean, a lot of people still want the traditional suburb with the automobile orientation, but the tide has really turned a lot of ways. So a lot of people are choosing to live in walkable neighborhoods and things like that. And they've got different reasons, but I think, I think there's a lot of potential for Christian ministry and outreach and connecting with you can obviously reach people with the gospel in the suburbs. There's lots of really good methods for doing that. And I support all that. I'm not anti-suburb, but I think what we need to be paying attention to from a Christian standpoint is how this demographic has shifted back to the city and to neighborhoods. And we need to start thinking about ministry models that are going to work in that context.
In your book, you talk about the 3 different pieces of glass that have affected us culturally as Americans. So those 3 pieces of glass, the windshield, the TV screen, and our smartphones, how do those prevent us from experiencing belonging the way that I guess God intended?
That's a great question. So let me back up just a little bit. The problem that's sort of got me writing in this direction was loneliness. Loneliness has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years, even before COVID, if you can remember back then. We were already starting to talk about loneliness. As people were thinking about the antidote to loneliness or ways we can solve the problem of loneliness, a lot of the solutions, a lot of the ideas had to do with relationships. We need more friends. If you're feeling lonely, you need more people in your life. And that's certainly part of it. But I also think that it's a little bit broader than that people don't just feel lonely in a relational sense. I think people also feel somewhat disconnected from where they live and just the whole context of everything. And I think that all that is the symptom of some choices we made as a culture over the last, century or so, where I think we chose to rather than have face-to-face human contact, rather than really connecting with one another in the places that we live, we chose to separate ourselves in one way or another. And that's where the 3 pieces of glass came up. It's kind of a historical study, but it started with the automobile. When we're in an automobile, we treat each other differently, right? Most people do. Some people are super nice, but most people I know are not as nice to other people when they're driving their automobile, right? They're saying things, they're making gestures. You don't encounter another person as a person as much when you're driving an automobile. They're like a competitor for lane space, for parking space, and a potential danger. If they've been drinking or are sleepy while they're driving, they can endanger you and your family. So you tend to, treat them not as well. We're less civil when we're spending time in our automobile. And since that turn towards the suburbs, where we created an environment where everything's separated, you have to get into your car to get everywhere. You're spending more and more time in your car. What that means is you have less and less time where you're actually interacting with people, face to face. You're mostly encountering people, especially in the civic realm, people you don't know personally, you're encountering as fellow drivers. And so that's eroded a little bit of our civility, that particular move. And then we created, that turn towards the suburbs changed the way that we created our neighborhoods. We created, instead of people sitting on their front porches and people walking the neighborhood and saying hi to each other, like like they used to. Now, if you look at a suburban neighborhood, they tend to have a big garage in front, and you drive through your garage, you just go right into your house. There's no front porch usually. There's just a garage there. And so we've lost that sense of kind of organic neighborly relationships where people, talk on the front porch. And so the second piece of glass then is the television screen. Like the way I kind of frame it is we got a little bit, we used to sit on our front porch and talk to our neighbors and get a lot of drama and interest in that. But now that we've moved indoors and don't talk to our neighbors that way, we've gotten a little bit bored. And so we've turned on the TV and we create these relationships with, TV characters or reality stars. And we kind of have that's another mediated screen that we deal with. And that doesn't make us incivil so much as it makes us kind of voyeuristic. We get all worked up by watching our favorite TV show. We're for this character, we're against that character. Those aren't real relationships because they don't make any demands on us. That's a one-way relationship. And so it's kind of like we tap out some of our emotional instincts on these fake relationships with TV characters, and there's less left over for the kinds of relationships that we're supposed to have with real people. So that's the second piece of glass. So we've got this automobile that makes us incivil. We've got this television screen that makes us kind of voyeuristic. And we created a world where you can live kind of completely separated from people by those two screens. You can wake up in the morning, watch your morning talk show on the TV, get in your car, right in your garage, drive to your office, park in the garage, go up an elevator, work in a cubicle all day and come back the next day. And you don't really encounter another stranger in the civic realm in a direct fashion, right? And then there's just a couple of exceptions to that rule. This is all kind of pre-COVID. You got to go to the grocery store or you got to pick up your kids from school, right? You got to go out and actually encounter other people in those settings typically. And that's the third piece of glass. We bring our phones into those settings so that if you go to a playground where moms and dads are waiting to pick up their kids, more than half of them are staring down at their phones. And the phone kind of has the worst of both worlds on those other two pieces of glass. We're pretty incivil on our phones. When you think about the kind of comments we make on social media to people, we say pretty rude things because we don't have a direct connection. That's similar to how we treat people in our cars. We also are a little bit voyeuristic on our phones. We're watching some really touching human interest story from across the planet on Facebook or whatnot. And not really, that's more interesting than the actual person standing next to us. We're getting sucked into some drama that we have no connection to rather than really interacting with the person in the grocery store line or the person on the playground. So the phone kind of is this, third piece of glass that completes the loop. It really allows us to never have to really talk to another person face to face anymore. It's pretty seductive, all the information that's available to you on a phone, all the excitement and whatnot. But it doesn't, at the end of the day, I think it doesn't leave you satisfied like you really made a connection in the way that we've been designed to make connections with other people. So I'm not surprised we're a lonely culture because of those three big choices.
It's a weird thing that our generation has had to grapple with. And I mean, tons of people have written about it to the point where I think talking about it in certain ways is almost trite because it's like, oh, phone bad.
Right.
You can talk about how it's bad, but that doesn't mean your commentary is helpful. But I think the points you're making are very, they're real because it's like, well, here's why it's bad. We're meant for community.
Right.
And you can be connected, but still not be getting that. And in fact, I guess probably the word Bob would use would be disintegrating with other people because of the increase in hostility through social media and to the point where it's affecting real life friendships.
A few months, probably about a year before the pandemic, the ministry organization I'm in started using Zoom. And I thought, this is a really great platform. I've done Skype and I didn't like it, but Zoom is just really well done. And then they went public and I'm like, I should probably purchase some stock in Zoom. I did not.
Come on.
Can you believe it? It's like, right?
Disappointing.
So how is Zoom helping or hurting this?
That is the question. I don't know if I've been thinking a lot about that. It's kind of funny. The book came out, right as the pandemic was hitting. And so, a couple months into it, I'm like, does this prove or disprove everything I just said? It's kind of like, and I think it's it's just gotten more nuanced. It's more interesting. I still think we were wired for face-to-face human connection. I still think that's biblical, and that's lines up with our experience. Like I really don't want to be too much of an ideologue or too much of an extremist in certain things. I think that as long as we remember that we're meant for that, we can leverage various technologies for that end. I think we just have to be careful, So I think on the one hand, Zoom, if used right, can really increase the frequency of our connection with people. It can increase the breadth of the kinds of people we can interact with. It can open up the dialogue in some really helpful ways. I think Zoom can also, at least my experience, a lot of people are pretty Zoom fatigued. I think that is a testimony to the fact that we're not meant to communicate long-term in this way. The author that I ran across after I wrote my book, Kurt Thompson, he's a psychiatrist, but of the brain basically. But he talks about the reason for Zoom fatigue is that our bodies and our brains are wired for face-to-face human contact. And when we're on a Zoom call, he likens it to, how like when your laptop or your phone is trying to make a Wi-Fi connection, it's looking for the network and it's spinning, trying to find a network. It's checking, there's 100 networks on the block, and it's trying to find one that it can connect with. And it's just like, you can save battery on both by turning off that feature because it's spending a lot of energy looking for a connection. He said that's happening when you're on a Zoom call. Your body's trying to make a physical contact because there's a lot, even though we can see each other, there's a lot of body language we can't pick up, and you're looking for that information, and you're trying to overcompensate for the fact that you can't use body language. So you're using your voice more to say stuff that your body would just naturally say, and your body just senses something's wrong, and it's trying to make a connection when it's just a screen, and so it's really tiring us out. So I think. As much as I think once the pandemic is over and life returns to normal, I think we're going to hold on to a lot of the Zoom things that we've, a lot of tricks that we've learned. We're going to continue live streaming our service on Sunday mornings because we got really good at it, and a lot of people like that. And it's going to allow a lot of folks to stay consistent in worship. So we're going to keep that. But I also think a lot of our people are really longing to get back together. They can actually hear my sermon better and see me more up close on Zoom, but they want to be there, not because they want to hear my sermon. They want to be there because they want to be in the same room as other people, and they want to have that bodily experience again. And so I think in some ways, it's made us more aware of our hunger for face-to-face human community. And I think I don't know how long we'll remember that, but I think we'll hold on to that.
I conceptually very much agree with your kind of analysis of belonging, community, and the need to be proximate with one another, the need to foster real face-to-face connections with other people. And I think about my life and the geographically, the places that I live, the places that are near to me haven't really allowed for that organically at all. I live in a formerly rural town that is, more of a suburban development now. Yeah. So there aren't really any sidewalks that connect anything. It's little enclave neighborhoods everywhere. Me and my friends always joke about our town that we're about half an hour from everywhere. Yeah. So there we have a medium-sized town. We have Akron half an hour north. We have Canton half an hour south. And again, that's give or take. So for me, that was just always a given that to do in my town, there's my neighborhood. I could walk around and chat with my neighbors, but to really do anything, you need to drive half an hour to go anywhere, to do anything. Yeah. So I was joking about this. Kind of all came up because I was joking with Bob. You talk about one of the big, screens that's kind of hampering us is the windshield. Yeah. And I'm a pretty big car enthusiast. I drove here and my beat up bright blue Subaru that's really loud and pollutes and it's falling apart. But especially when I was in college, and it's changed a little bit since I started working because of other things, but especially when I was in college, a huge community that I found belonging in was the car community. Yeah. A town about 25 minutes from me had a car club that would meet every single week. And so I would drive every single week, and we would literally just meet in empty parking lots. And, you'd have, dozens of cars. There were core groups of people that got to know each other very well, that were all very different, politically different, diversity with ethnicity, diversity with income. I think that was when I kind of realized, for me, finding those communities, just with the way the towns that I live around are built,
Yeah.
requires finding a subculture.
Yeah.
And, and I've seen similar things with other hobbies. Like I've gone with friends who are really into board games, and they'll go to the local board game shop, and it's the same regulars every Tuesday night playing this game and every Wednesday night playing this game.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to hear, like, I guess what's your take on that? Because as much as I really do agree with your vision for that geographical and architectural model of a community, like what would your advice be for those of us who are stuck living in a suburb?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I love your stories. Actually, that's helpful for me to be reminded. But I do think, again, I don't want to be an ideologue, because I do think there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. And, different technologies and different tools can get us the right thing as well as move us in the wrong direction. So it sounds like the car club was a great example of how you made it work, and it sounds like what you're using a car, of course, is a windshield, all the stuff that I can, kind of grouse about. But at the end of the day, you've got a group of people that you're hanging out with face to face. And that sounds like a step in the right direction. So I would say continue to look for those kinds of opportunities would be one thing. And then, secondly, just be tuned in, because to even your own community. And obviously I haven't been to those places that you've lived in or are talking about, but I know that this conversation is really getting a lot of momentum. And so even in a traditional suburb, things like walkability and mixed use, the things that you're building, that you were talking about, where you've got apartments above and you've got shops below, those things they're having, your city council or whatnot is thinking about those kinds of things. They're trying to figure out, how can we make that work in our community? And I do think that's one place where, as a Christian who cares about things like belonging and shalom and things like that, you can get in on those conversations and help. There's resources out there like the Sprawl Repair Manual is a book that was written. How do you turn like a traditional suburb into more walkable? And lots of people are thinking about those kinds of things. So at the same time as, make it work where you are. Just be aware of the fact that as your wherever you live is engaging some of that conversation, you can be part of the force that moves it in a more humane direction. Who does a kind of interesting job with that is Randy Frazee. He wrote a couple books. He's a really interesting counterexample to kind of where I'm coming from. Randy and I have interacted a little bit over the years, but we both read a lot of the new urbanist stuff that I was talking about earlier. And I kind of came to the conclusion, because of where I grew up in my context, that this is, we need to build places like this. We need to really change the way we do things. Randy was more like you're describing. He grew up in suburbs, always worked in the suburbs. He's like, we're not going to change the suburbs anytime soon. Let's figure out how to make the suburbs more humane. And he did some really funny things, like, for instance, because one of the things that the housing style in the suburbs is it's kind of backyard oriented. Instead of a front porch and that kind of stuff, you've got a play set in the backyard. You've got a grill in the backyard. Everything's oriented. It kind of turns its back on the public realm. And that's how the suburbs are designed for a lot of reasons, And what Frazee did in one of the places he lived is he just dragged his play set to the front yard. It's not supposed to be there, but he's like, what? Kids playing, that's a natural magnet for community. And he dragged a bench to his front yard. And he's like, that's where I'm going to sit when I get home from work. I'm going to sit on my front yard, even though it's not designed for that. I'm going to sit there because that's where I'm going to see my neighbors driving home. And as before they roll into their garage, they might wave at me, or they might get out and we'll have a conversation, or my kids are going to play in the front yard and maybe their kids will come over too. And we'll, so he's trying to do some tweaks in a more automobile oriented environment to make it more better for those organic connections. So I do think there's things it sounds like you're already kind of doing some of those things. I wouldn't, I'd say you're doing the right thing in doing that. So
yeah, it's always seeking that face-to-face
as
much as possible. So that's something I've really appreciated about Brendan is at a commuter campus, he drove, but he made friends in a Christian group. Mm-hmm. And then he would go to the car group, and then he was into paintballing. So he would go to the paintball place all the time and meet the same exact people all the time. It's like consistently saying, I've got to do that. And it takes work. Yeah. It's not necessarily convenient.
Right.
It's much easier just to be in a Facebook group or
Well, one of the elements, and I think this kind of underscores what you just said, Bob, and what Brandon, you're modeling a little bit, is one of the elements that build relationships is frequency. And so yeah, you got a car group, you got a paintball group. But if you don't just have an endless cycle of types of things that you might do to keep your brain stimulated, but you narrow it a little bit. So you're going to the car group every week, you're going to the paintball group, you have that frequency, and that's where you start to build those organic connections. And so I think, trying to steward your time in a way that you can pick the groups that are really life-giving for you, exciting for you, that you're going to keep coming back to, so you can build those relationships over time. That's going to be really important.
So we're going to let you go to your front porch happy hour.
Thanks.
Thank
It
you.
was a fun conversation. I hope we got some useful material there, and I'll be curious to see how your listeners respond to it. So
yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Reintegrate podcast. We'd love for you to come back again next week. If you like Reintegrate, please write a quick review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app to encourage others to listen too. Be sure to check out my ministries at re-integrate.org. Remember the dash. I work with college students, churches, and marketplace leaders, helping them all to reintegrate the Christian faith with all of life, especially our vocations. At the web page, you'll find lots of articles on reintegrating your callings with God's mission, online and published resources, links to the Reintegrate YouTube channel, and much more.